Hey, welcome to part 2 of episode 12 of my NOTCAST, where I talk about whatever rubbish comes to mind. I had a couple of minutes break, had to answer the door to check the post, and we're just about to dive into, I think, the last part of the story of Pink Floyd's middle-aged years. So, we last left off with The Wall. So The Wall was released in late 1979, and it was preceded for the first time in a large number of years by a single, which was Pink Floyd's biggest hit, which is Another Brick in the Wall. And it's backed with One of My Turns. It was, I think, a bit of a success. Might have been a number one, actually, I'm not sure. Now, the original demo of Another Brick in the Wall is quite a skeletal, short, 2-verse piece. And again, Roger Waters gets the full credit for that. But it wasn't all his work. The producer, Bob Ezrin, came up with the idea of repeating it, adding a chorus in there, adding a guitar solo, speeding the track up, putting the drum beat over the top of it, which you probably already know. And even though Roger Waters was credited with it, he wasn't the only person that had any creative involvement in that album at all. Not in the slightest. Although maybe you could say that he was the lead actor. The idea that Roger Waters was the sole creative genius behind Pink Floyd and the sole person that thought of all this clearly wasn't correct. So the Wall came as a double album, and as I mentioned, also a film. The double album was cut down in size not long before release. Some of the songs were shuffled out, some of the tracks and the mixes were edited. There's a lot of debate on the internet about that. I don't have an opinion around it. What I do find is, as I said, the film contains some very, very different recordings, which we will touch upon shortly. So, 2011 saw the release of the Immersion box set version. Again, more marbles. Why? Why do people have Pink Floyd marbles? More coasters. God knows. I mean, do you really have enough friends if you're a Pink Floyd fan that buys all of these box sets to actually go and have 12 people around in your house? I don't know. I probably shouldn't say that. There's a sticker, a scarf. Again, memorabilia. Shall we see what's in here? I have no idea. An unusual shaped ticket of The Wall, and a backstage pass for the first show at the Nassau Coliseum in February 1980. So when the album came out, it only played live in 4 cities, which I think was New York, Nassau, maybe Los Angeles, and London Earl's Court over a period of 2 years. And again, no idea why. Obviously, that's something that changed over the years. It was a very expensive, very elaborate stage show. It cost at least as much to put on as the tickets did. And so, therefore, the only member of the band that made any money during the live shows was Rick Wright. So, during the recording of The Wall, Rick Wright was fired by the band. But he didn't leave. He became a session musician. He finished the album recordings. He played live, was paid a salary, and therefore was the only member of Pink Floyd to make money from the Wall live shows. Smart thinking, guys. Fire the guy and make sure he's got the money, which you don't then have. The box set features, some charming art, which is at least borderline misogynist. There's a huge amount of misogyny in The Wall, actually, and I'm not a fan of that in the slightest. Women are portrayed in a very negative light, probably on the basis of Roger Waters' experiences, but as you probably know, he wasn't the nicest of guys in the world at that point. He was, very driven by his artistic vision, and as I understand it, can be difficult to work with and for. But I think we'll talk about that some other time. Here's also a photo book that comes with it, which features a shot of the band, except that isn't really the band. At that point, Pink Floyd were fully replicating their lineup with extra musicians. So Snowy White was still there on guitar. I think they had, an extra keyboard player. They had an extra drummer. They had a quartet of male backing vocalists. They had just lots of additional musicians. So the idea of Pink Floyd as a band being 4 people had clearly just become an extension of whatever was going on. So there's I think 7 discs on this. So there's discs 1 and 2 of the album. Discs 3 and 4 are live recordings. Disc 5 and 6 is starts off with excerpts from Roger's original demos. They are so bad you don't want to hear the full songs. And because it's Roger Waters on his own, who's not got the best or widest range in the world, tapping everything out and doing it in a very scratchy basis on an acoustic guitar. It's pretty shoddy. You can tell they're demos, and actually when you listen to them you can really see the amount of work that the band put into it. Then there's also Program 2, which is original demos and band demos. Then the band did a series of demos again, which stretches out onto the other CD. And in total, you have something like 46 demo tracks from the album, which gives you... Let me just quickly check. So there's an early version of Comfortably Numb, which is called The Doctor. There's early version of Sexual Revolution, which actually later became a Roger Waters solo song and has not been released in any other way by the band. I don't think What Shall We Do Now is on here at all. There's a track called Teacher Teacher, which is actually on the subsequent album, The Final Cut. And it's not an amazing set, to be honest. You can really see that the band were trying to mould the material into something that was workable and something that made sense. And the band and the producer, Bob Ezrin, got a lot of effort into creating a presentable version of the album. And full credit to them, because I'm not exactly sure, listening to that, how you would have made the difference. So when The Wall was released, Roger Waters gave Pink Floyd 2 full and complete albums that he'd recorded on his own, and said, you can have one of these, and one of these is going to be my solo album. And he presented to them the pros and cons of hitchhiking, and he presented to them The Wall, and they chose to follow The Wall, because I think, as David said, he felt that there was more potential inside that for a full release. So what is surprising about this release, actually, the 7-disc version of The Wall, is that the Blu-ray contains 2 minutes of live footage. So even though the shows were filmed with the aim of being released, for some reason they've not been released yet. I don't particularly know why. I don't particularly care, because there's lots and lots of bootlegs floating around. But I do think it is a little strange that they were never released. So, following on from the release of The Wall, as I said, the band played, I think, about 30 live shows in 4 cities over 2 years, stealing a guitarist from Thin Lizzy along the way. They released a number of further singles. They released Comfortably Numb, and they released Run Like Hell. Now, if you know Comfortably Numb, you know it's a fantastic song. It was never released as a 7-inch single in the UK. There was an edit of it that was released in America. This version I've got here is a Columbia Records Hall of Fame reissue of a double A side, primarily because trying to find a copy of Comfortably Numb that's not going to break the bank on a 7-inch single is really bloody difficult. And the band then released a film of The Wall, but in 1999 the band did their first retrospective live release, which was Is There Anybody Out There? The Wall live at Earl's Court. which was very sympathetically packaged, compiled across existing live recordings of every show which they had, and really acted as a a complement to the studio version of the album. Now this live release, I think, corrected some of the oversights from the original. This is a deluxe edition of Is There Anybody Out There? I mean, effectively you had two different covers, and you had a very, very elaborate book of CDs, photographs, text, imagery, so on and so forth. And the release of this live record, Is There Anybody Out There, was also the first time that I think The Wall was released live by Pink Floyd. It also featured for the first time an official release of the track What Shall We Do Now, which was taken off the original LP, as I said earlier. And What Shall We Do Now is a great Pink Floyd song, actually. I'm very surprised that it hasn't been released on one of the compilations or one of the best ofs, or as a B-side or something at some point over the years. And I think that that's a real crime of omission, because the studio recording clearly exists. The studio recording is also used in the soundtrack to the film. This is a bootleg CD of the audio music tracks which were used in the film of The Wall. And the film of The Wall completely re-recorded a lot of the numbers, so they were either orchestrated, re-recorded, new vocals were added, new lyrics were added. Mother, for example, is a completely separate recording. What Shall We Do Now is on here. It has a different ending. Empty Spaces is longer. Young Lust has a different introduction, I think. And the whole thing is just different. And it's almost like they use the film as a way of getting the stuff that they couldn't release on the live set, or more correctly on the 2 album version out. Instead of releasing an album of the soundtrack, although the film did tell us that there'd be a soundtrack of the album, there was a 7-inch single with this cheerful cover of When the Tigers Broke Free, backed with a re-recording of Bring the Boys Back Home. And When the Tigers Broke Free, just look at how cheerful that film is, eh? There is no singular film that ever quite captures just the air of self-absorbed teenage angst, quite like this particular whole period of the band. If you ever thought that you're full of teenage angst, if you thought that no human could ever love you because, I don't know, you had bad hair or spots or something like that, or you thought that you believed what you were told by the people that bullied you at school, or that you thought that all women were evil because none of them would hold your hands when you were 14 years old, The Wall is the album for you, to make you feel that you have been done wrong by the whole of the rest of the outside world, as opposed to what you are, which is actually as the normal, ordinary person with a typical set of circumstances. I mean, certainly I'm projecting here, talking about me as a 14-year-old boy. Even as a 14-year-old, I thought The Wall was fucking miserable. It still is. I mean, it's a good album. It's artistically meaningful, but there is nothing quite as adolescent as that particular record that I've ever heard in the story of my life. And I'm pretty surprised that the album was so lauded. It was very good, but really needed a bit of judicious editing. Now, surprisingly, The Wall, as Is There Anybody Out There, has never been released on vinyl. Now, you'd have thought with all of Pink Floyd's repackaging they would release it on vinyl, but there isn't. This is a vinyl bootleg of a show at Earl's Court. This copy's pretty beat up, but all copies are pretty beat up these days of that, and that features 3 LPs of live material recorded by a Walkman in the audience. And it all went a little bit quiet for Pink Floyd for a little while. Their record label in America, Columbia, wanted to release a greatest hits. The band settled for a thing called A Great Collection of Dance Songs. This was photographed at Dungeness, which is a beach, which is the only part of Britain that has desert-like conditions in it. Just out of shot is a nuclear power station, and there's some of the homes there. That's about 20 minutes from where we are right now. This album in itself is not necessarily worth getting. It has one exclusive track on it. It's got a re-recording of Money by David Gilmour and Dick Parry, which for contractual reasons they weren't allowed to use the original studio recording from Dark Side of the Moon because they changed record labels in America, so they re-recorded it, and it's a very serviceable re-recording, but it sounds a lot lighter and a lot lumpier. A lot lighter and a little bit more rigid than it lacks the grace, I think, of the studio version on Dark Side of the Moon. So what came next? Well, Rick had come to the end of his time in the band. Rick had been fired by Roger because Roger thought that Rick wasn't pulling his weight. Now, Rick might not have been pulling his weight, but I don't think Roger was allowing anybody to really contribute in the way in which they'd previously done so. So previously, it had been 4 members of the band that had been bringing music together, working on it together. Roger had very clearly assumed control. The demos which we've got on the wall set here, and also on this, which is a bootleg CD of demos from the Final Cut album, very clearly kind of laid out that the band were being controlled by Roger and his vision, and the other members of the band weren't being allowed to contribute. So David and Rick and Nick started releasing solo records to varying degrees of artistic and commercial success. It's probably the nicest way of describing it. All was not lost, although it was in one respect, is pretty much as soon as the film of The Wall had finished, Roger had taken some of the extra songs that he'd written for The Wall, which hadn't been used, added some extra songs about the Falklands War, and came up with the Final Cut, which is the last studio record that Roger recorded with Pink Floyd. It's also the only Pink Floyd studio album that doesn't have any contribution from Rick Wright. Rick's contribution was replaced by orchestrations from Michael Kamen, who was a film composer and who did the soundtracks to things like Lethal Weapon 1 and 2. He worked with Metallica on the S&M album. He worked with David Gilmour on the Meltdown concert. Michael Kamen's role was to play piano and harmonium, and Andy Bowen played Hammond organ, although he didn't play very much Hammond organ. And even by the last song on the album, Nick Mason wasn't playing drums. It was Andy Newmark playing drums on Two Sons. And this is a heavy listen. So if you hadn't heard enough songs about the death of Roger Waters' dad, Anzio, in 1944, despite the final lines of When the Tigers Broke Free, about how His Majesty signed in his own rubber stamp, and that's how the army took my daddy away from me, which is the closing words on When the Tigers Broke Free. If you haven't heard enough songs about Roger Waters' dead dad, then you have plenty of songs on the Final Cut to listen to. And whilst you can argue that all art is autobiography, I also would quite like all art to be a little less autobiographical sometimes. So the Final Cut, I think one of my brother's friends described this as, well, asked him, why are you listening to stuff that sounds like Meatloaf? Which is fighting talk. This is better than Meatloaf. Sorry, Meatloaf fans, I'm not a fan of him. But the Final Cut is called A Requiem for the Post-War Dream by Roger Waters. There is not much ambiguity that you can say about that. It's very clearly an album that's designed to talk about the futility of war, the futility of death within war, and inspired by the Falklands War. It came out with some some quite tough words, actually. I mean, lyrically, it's fantastic. It's really strong lyrics. But then the subject and the content of those lyrics, I kind of figure it really has not aged particularly well. So the whole thing the whole of this album draws comparisons between the Falklands War and the Second World War, and how the fact that war is eternal and ongoing. There's a theory in history that after about 70 years, people forget the horrors of previous historical events and they start to repeat them. And that is something which is repeated in this. Is right from the, I think the opening lines of the album. Tell me true, tell me why was Jesus crucified? Is it for this that Daddy died? And I was like, oh my God, mate, you're a grown man with daddy issues, and there are other things to talk about. When somebody kind of mentioned to Rick Wright about this album, he said he was a bit bored of hearing about Roger's dead dad. It's a good album. It's heavy listen. It doesn't sound like Pink Floyd at all. I think there's 1.5 guitar solos on it. I think David Gilmour sings on half a song. Nick Mason is absent for 10 or so minutes at a time, which means that for huge chunks of the album it's Roger and an orchestra and him singing about his deceased dad, as opposed to anything that you conceivably could think would sound like Pink Floyd. There's very little of what sounds like Pink Floyd in here, although if you talk to Roger, he'd probably say that was the most Pink Floyd album there ever was, because I am Pink Floyd and everyone else is not. Now, it's got some good songs on it. Not Now John is a great song. The Final Cut is good but heavy. Two Suns in the Sunset is a really, really strong song. And I think Two Suns is a very underrated track by anybody. And it's only in the past couple of years that Roger has ever played it live. But it's a great Pink Floyd song, actually. And it's just very, very forgotten on the grounds that it's stuck at the end of the last song by the former bass player who spent most of his time telling us about how his dad was killed by the Nazis. This is the original CD release from 1983, actually. So it's digitally mastered. It was mastered in, I think a thing called Q sound, so it uses a very wide range of the stereo. The stereo, the production on it, fantastic. The drum sound is immaculate. The songs just aren't there, and the band have travelled a very, 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 very long way from Piper at the Gates of Dawn. They've moved into, I think, probably a genre called paranoid rock, which is very miserable. There's very little light in it. There's very little scope. There's very little room. Very tense, very claustrophobic. It's not a fun listen at all. It's a great album, but it's certainly not where you should start with Pink Floyd, and it's certainly not in their best. Now, at this point, the writing was very clearly on the wall, I think. It was a single, Not Now John. If you haven't got the single, it's worth picking up for two reasons. Firstly, it's got a different vocal than the album version. The album version has a lot of swear words in it. This one has people shouting stuff at the top of their voice louder than the swear words. It's also got, on the B-side, it's got The Hero's Return Parts 1 and Parts 2. And Part 2 is an extra verse and ending, which was taken out of the album and excised from it. So if you want to hear The Hero's Return Part 2, you have to get Not Now John on single. It was available on 7-inch and 12-inch. Also, as you'll see, it says produced by Roger Waters, James Guthrie and Michael Kamen. David Gilmour was meant to be a producer on this. He did a lot of production work on it. David and Roger were disagreeing immensely, and David had his name taken off the production credits, but he still got the royalties for it. Who cares about that, really? David earned the money, he put in the work, and he probably didn't want to necessarily be associated with such a difficult album that he barely played on and barely sang on. And at that point, it was pretty clear that things were pretty hard in the Pink Floyd world. Roger had assumed creative control of the band. Rick had been fired. Nick had been sidelined and hadn't played drums, certainly on stage, for a couple of years by the time it was recorded. David was reduced to basically cameoing in his own album. And as soon as it was completed, Roger wasn't going to tour the album. He decided that he was going to go straight back into the studio, the same studio that he'd recorded the final cut in, and pick up with the pros and cons of hitchhiking. And the only thing that's different between the pros and cons of hitchhiking and the final cut is that Nick Mason and David Gilmour aren't on the pros and cons of hitchhiking. The rest of the cast of players is exactly the same. And Andy Newmark, I think, plays drums on pros and cons, and Eric Clapton plays guitar on pros and cons. So really, pros and cons is if Roger Waters could have put the name Pink Floyd on that and released that as a Pink Floyd album and didn't have to bother with a solo career, I'm sure he would have absolutely done that and still regarded it as completely valid and correct. History will judge him differently. When I get to episode 4, I'll talk about the solo years. But what we did have is the final cut was really the last creative embers of the 4-piece of Pink Floyd. You know, Rick had already been fired. Nick was halfway out the door. David was very frustrated at not being able to contribute any material to it. So David released a solo album called About Face in 1984. When asked about this album, David called it the final straw, which I think probably sums up the creative relationship had broken down completely at that point. And that was the end of Pink Floyd with Roger Waters in them. So that gives you like an overview of the middle years. What I will say is that there are, the immersion editions of Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, on the wall, massive multi-disc sets, very, very nice packages. Keep an eye on the price, don't pay too much for them. If you want to go all in, that's where to go. There is not an immersion edition of Animals. There is a 5.1 mix, which hasn't been released yet because David and Roger are disagreeing on certain things relating to that. There's no expanded edition of the final cut, probably because neither Dave nor Nick seem to have much interest in that album. And again, Roger and David seem to disagree in a great many ways. There's also not much extra material you can put on the final cut. You could put a documentary, which would likely be Roger telling everyone he's a genius, and David and Nick telling you that Roger was actually a despot and a dictator. And then you could have 4 promo videos which were shot. Now, the only member of Pink Floyd that appears in those promo videos is Roger Waters in shadow, miming along to the tracks. So it'd be a pretty thin release, maybe 2 CDs and a DVD at most. And as I said, for Animals, there's no circulating or releasable quality recordings from the 1977 tour that they're prepared to issue. Also point out that there's no live film of Pink Floyd between 1972, which was the little episodes that were shot in Brighton, and 1987, apart from the bootleg, which is circulating at the wall in 1980. Now, the reason for that, and there's been quite a lot of debate on the internet about this, why isn't there like Pink Floyd and the Dark Side of the Moon tour on DVD and high def? Guys, get a rewind. 1973 was, if you released a concert film, it played in cinemas. It played in cinemas at 11:15 on a Friday night to an audience of stoners every Friday and Saturday night. Sell-through videos didn't exist. Concert DVDs, nobody had even invented the DVD. The concert VHS didn't exist either because no one invented VHS until about 1982. They didn't film every show. They didn't film every tour because there wasn't the market for it. There wasn't going to be the money. They weren't going to get the money back from that because having cinema runs isn't going to give you enough money to justify spending millions of pounds on filming in a multi-camera high-def environment. That's just not going to be the case. It's not going to be viable. So the only film footage that exists of Pink Floyd between about 1973 and 1979 is hand-shot bootleg recordings made by people that have smuggled small 8mm, 16mm cameras into the venues on the night, and they film maybe 10-12 minutes of silent footage. You can put the whole thing together, there's maybe 40 minutes which you can put together, and it's pretty crappy, and there's no audio that goes with it. There's The Wall, which obviously hasn't been released for various reasons, but those are not reasons I particularly care about. The shows are circulating if you know where to find them on the internet. I'm going to bring this to a close pretty shortly. I've been talking for longer than I expected about Pink Floyd. In fact, I've been talking for what feels like an hour and a quarter, and I've only really touched upon a 10-year period in the middle. The next part I'll be talking about the later years, which is from 1987 onwards. After Roger had left, what happened next? What I will say is these 5 albums that came out at this time, they're very good records. They're not easy records to listen to. They are tough. You can't listen to them and just zone out. Really, there's a lot of joy in parts of it, but the band changes completely from Dark Side of the Moon to the final cut. Creatively, they're very clearly working at opposite ends of the spectrum. And the music is the music is what matters. So I'm going to wrap up here. Hopefully I'm going to check the news and we're going to have some good news about the election, but I don't want to jinx it, so I guess we'll find out later. Thank you for your time and interest, and I will catch up with you some other time. Thank you. And again, as the usual stuff, if you like it, say so, subscribe, ask questions, do whatever you want to do. If you've got any suggestions, let me know and we'll stay in touch, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.